children of all ages. Stay Weird Network proudly brings you Cards Subject to Change with Hassel. This week, as you can tell by peeping the fit, we got a Great Muta episode, the Pearl of the Orient himself. So, we're going to ask the question, what if the card was subject to change and the Great Muta joined the WWF in 1993? Are you ready? Let's buckle up. Let's hit the road, people. So, we will still have the spectacle of what was WrestleMania 9 with that bullshit Hogan finish with Yoko. I'm sorry, people. It fits with the narrative of what we're going with. So we still have that. Now, in our timeline, not our what if timeline, but in our actual timeline, on May 3rd, 1993, the WWF champion Hulk Hogan went to Japan and wrestled the IWGP champion, the Great Muta. And if you haven't seen this is actually one hell of a matchup. Hogan could actually chain wrestle, which anyone that thinks he couldn't, Al Snow has said this many times. If you think Hogan really can't wrestle, you're full of shit, because Matsuda would not have trained him and put him out there if it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't wrestle. He can wrestle, and he could wrestle then. He just chose to wrestle a safe style that Vince wanted him to wrestle so that he could do 320 days a year, or if you're listening to his interviews lately, 400 days a year, because, hey, that's out there, people. Google it. But if people want to wrestle 400 days a year, like he says, he had to wrestle a safe style per Vince. So, but in Japan, he knew he was at the end of his deal. He goes and he has a banger of a matchup with Muta. This is actually, I highly recommend Googling this matchup. It's a great matchup, honestly. So, he still has this matchup. This is where we enter our alternate timeline. So after this matchup, on Raw, 2 weeks later, the Hulkster, the Hulkster and Jimmy Hart are down ringside. They're being interviewed by Vince McMahon, and he's going over it when out comes none other than Jim Cornette. And he tells Hogan, 2 weeks ago, you went over to Japan and you tried to do your best to embarrass the Pearl of the Orient, the Great Muta. So I think it's only fitting that I bring the Great Muta here to embarrass you. And at King of the Ring, you will defend your WWF Championship against none other than the Great Muta. At which point, Muta comes out from under the ring, missed Hogan in the face. He and Jimmy, he gets Jimmy Hart as well, and him and Jim Cornette then escape and get out of there. On Superstars, Jim Cornette and the Great Muta are guests on the Heartbreak Hotel. Do your research, people. At the Heartbreak Hotel, Jim Cornette tells Hogan, you tried to be disrespectful to their champion, so it was only fitting that Muta was disrespectful to you. Now, the King of the Ring, he will be the WWF champion. On Raw, the week of the King of the Ring, Hogan and Jimmy Hart come down with Brutus Beefcake, Brother Brudi. And they cut a typical Hogan interview. Muta and Jim Cornette come out from behind. Yoko and Mr. Fuji attack Beefcake and Hogan, leaving them laying. Muta hits the ring with them, and they put them things on them. At the end of it, Muta and Yoko bow to one another, forming an alliance, while Fuji and Jim Cornette shake hands, and they all exit the ring. On Superstars that weekend, in the main event, it's the Great Muta versus Sparky Plug. That's right, people. You'll know who he is. He gets a little hardcore later in time. Sparky Plug comes up on the losing end of this match here against the Great Muta. But at the end of it, out comes the Hulkster. He comes out, cleans house, runs Muta out. Muta gets Jim Cornette. They retreat. They haul ass. Now we enter King of the Ring, 1993, June. Hulk comes out and cuts an epic promo. One of his regular Hulkster promos, pumping the people up, guaranteeing victory tonight for all his little Hulkamaniacs. Muta, what you gonna do, brother, when Hulkamania runs wild on you. Bret would still, in this timeline, win the King of the Ring. But in the main event, we got WWF Champion Hulk Hogan versus the Great Muta in a solid 4-star matchup. Both men look good. Hogan does a little chain wrestling in the WWF. Muta goes for the mist and misses. Ref bump. Hogan goes and hits Muta with a chair at this point. Then the leg drop, but the ref is still down, people. Hogan goes to pick up Muta, and that's when Muta hits the mist. Not just the regular mist, but the black mist. Hogan is discombobulated. We don't get the bullshit fire. We have mist instead. Cornette hits Hogan with a loaded racket. Muta hits a shining wizard, a moonsault, and the 1, 2, 3 for the feint to hit a new WWF champion, the Great Muta. On Raw the next night, in the King's Court with Jerry the King Lawler, we got WWF champion, the Great Muta, Jim Cornette, Yokozuna, and Mr. Fuji. And they're all down there where Cornette is just yucking it up, talking about how Great Muta has killed Hulkamania. And hey, it'll be the last time we see Hulkamania in the WWF for roughly 8 years. As we all know, the next he all goes off the field, Thunder in Paradise. Then he goes to WCW. The rest is history. On Superstars, Muta and Yokozuna defeat the Smoking Guns. They win with a Shining Wizard Bonsai Drop combo because that's going to be their finisher, people. So we still have a little bit of things. You know, they do some destruction leading up to the 4th of July on the Intrepid, when we still get that feel-good moment as Lex Luger ascends down from the helicopter, body slams Yokozuna, setting up their matchup at SummerSlam. On Raw the next night, we get Mr. Perfect versus the Great Muta. Now, could you imagine Perfect and Muta? That could be just magic in the ring. Muta gets the win. He hits the Perfect with the mist. And then he goes up for not 1, but 2 moonsaults after the match. Then, as he goes to go up for the 3rd moonsault, gonna put the trifecta on him, people, we get none other than a bell tolling. And out comes the Undertaker. Now, Jim Cornette would get Muta, and he would get him to let's retreat and get the hell out of Dodge because he don't want no part of the Undertaker. On Superstars that week, Jim Cornette and Muta are on Heartbreak Hotel, and Jim Cornette, he's sidestepping questions about the Undertaker. Because Muta has no fear of any man walking the face of the planet. On Raw the next week, we get the Great Muta versus Tatanka for the WWF Championship. Now, at the time, Tatanka was on an impressive undefeated streak, winning with his Samoan drop into the trail. But on this night here, Tatanka begins to gain the advantage. But out of nowhere, the red mist is flying. DQ. Once again, moonsaults begin, and we get the bell tolling. This time, Taker comes from under the ring, and he and Muta fight to end the show. Now, on All American Wrestling, that was the Sunday program for those of you that don't know. On All American Wrestling, Gorilla Monsoon would announce that the Great Muta versus the Undertaker at SummerSlam for the WWF Championship inside of a steel cage where there is no escape. We get an epic build leading into SummerSlam with Muta and Taker, because you can just imagine the mind games that these two could play with one another in the upcoming weeks. That was one thing I do miss about these early to mid-90s WWF pay-per-views. You had a great build because there was only 4 or 5 a year. Actually, it was 5 at this point. So you had roughly a little better than 2.5 months usually between each one. So you got a great build there. And these two would be no exception to the rule. That's SummerSlam 1993, August. Lex Luger would get a count-out victory over Yokozuna with the loaded forearm. Inside the steel cage for the WWF Championship with the Great Muta and the Undertaker. We have a great matchup. Muta using the cage to his advantage in to help his move set. Taker chokeslams Muta to get some momentum, but then when he goes for the tombstone, Muta hits the red mist. Now Vince would really start selling this, as the red mist would be Muta's most poisonous mist, calling him a viper either. Could you imagine Vince McMahon calling The Undertaker versus the Great Muta? That right there in itself, I mean, you don't have to like the guy today, but I'm just saying, back then, Vince could really hype up a fucking match. At this point, Jim Cornette would cuff Taker to the cage. Muta would crawl out the door, narrowly escaping and retaining the WWF Championship. Now, throughout September and October, Muta will be a dominant champion, remaining undefeated inside the WWF, even defeating the Intercontinental Champion Razor Ramon on an episode of Raw during this time. Now, he would not go for the title. I want to leave the title on Razor because we got to have Razor Shawns throughout this summer, fall, WrestleMania. So we're going to leave the Intercontinental title out of the play. But he does defeat Razor Ramon, the bad guy. Now, on a November edition of Monday Night Raw, Yokozuna and Muta would win the WWF Tag Team Championships from none other than the Steiner brothers, in what will be just one more hell of a banger of a match. We didn't get a lot of bangers back then on Raw. This would be one. I would say that Muta, Yoko versus the Steiner brothers could be a solid 4.5 stars. Bill for the Survivor Series keeps up with the announcement that the Foreign Fanatics, the Great Muta, Yokozuna, Ludwig Borga, and Crush would go against the All-Americans, Lex Luger, the Steiner brothers, and a mystery opponent. Now on Raw, the week of Survivor Series, Jim and the Foreign Fanatics will be ringside, teasing the All-Americans, telling them they don't even have a fourth man, and they're going to get destroyed at Survivor Series. When none other than the bell tolls and out comes the Undertaker. He hits open that robe with the American flag on the inside. I know it's cheesy as fuck now, but back then, as a young lad, that was pretty damn cool to me. That stuck with me, and we're sticking it in this new timeline. Undertaker is the fourth man. Survivor Series, the Foreign Fanatics versus the All-Americans. I mean, that just screams Vince McMahon. Around the end of the matchup, Yokozuna would get eliminated when Lex would hit the loaded forearm again, people, getting Yokozuna counted out. This would leave the Great Muta against Lex Luger, The Undertaker, and Scott Steiner, as Rick had already been previously eliminated. Muta holds his own, pitting Scott Steiner, hitting the Shining Wizard. However, Luger and Taker would be wear Muta down with fast tags. Luger would eventually hit the forearm, but Muta kicks out at 2 3/4. That was huge at this time, people. However, at this point, The Undertaker would hit a tombstone on the Great Muta to pin him and give him his first pinfall loss inside of the WWF. Now, on a Christmas edition of the Monday Night Raw, Muta and Yoko would defend their tag titles against an unlikely duo of the Quebecers. Now, the Quebecers were another heel tag team, but occasionally we would get these heel versus heel matchups and face versus face matchups because they had won a matchup to become the number one contenders and go on to defend the titles if they win versus Brett and Owen at the Royal Rumble. And guess what, people? They do it. They upset Yoko and the Great Muta when Lex Luger comes out and distracts Yokozuna, setting up Yokozuna versus Luger for later on. Now on Superstars, The Undertaker and The Undertaker hits Yoko with the urn. I got ahead of myself with my notes, people. I apologize. The Undertaker hits Yokozuna with the urn, costing Yoko and Muta the tag team titles. Now on Superstars, The Undertaker versus Yokozuna in a casket match for the Royal Rumble is announced by none other than Gorilla Monsoon, people. He was the man back then. But on this same episode of Superstars, it would be announced that the Great Muta would defend his WWF World title against none other than the Macho Man, Randy Savage. Yeah. At the Royal Rumble, we still get the Undertaker losing this casket match and ascending to heaven. It's bad as it sounds, people. It really was. Even then, it kind of gives the cringe. But everybody, all the heels in the WWF, they help Yokozuna win. Taker ascends to the heavens, not to be seen again until the next year at SummerSlam. Owen still turns on Bret Hart this night. He kicks his leg out of his leg. That's another part of a promo you need to go check out. But in the Royal Rumble, Bret would win the Royal Rumble by himself when Yokozuna would distract Lex Luger, getting a small measure of revenge. In the WWF Championship match, the Great Muta, the champion, versus Macho Man. Now, this will be a really fun matchup. Macho shows there's still a lot left in the tank. Muta rolls out of the way of an elbow drop, then hits the Shining Wizard and the moonsault for the win and the retention. Muta is still your WWF champion. Now then we begin to get our Raw build for WrestleMania. As it is announced officially, Bret the Hitman Hart versus WWF champion, the Great Muta, as well as Yokozuna versus Lex Luger in a Falls Count Anywhere match, since Luger has won 2 matchups over Yoko, but not pinned him yet. Now, Owen Hart will still be attacking the hell out of Bret between then and WrestleMania, and it would finally be announced that Bret will pull double duty at WrestleMania. So we still get Owen versus Bret at WrestleMania on top of his WWF Championship match he earned in the Royal Rumble. Now, Raw 2 weeks before Mania, Muta and Yoko beat Bret and Lex Luger in a match when Owen Hart comes down and blasts Bret over the head with the WWF Championship. The week of WrestleMania on Raw, we get Jim Cornette and Muta down there being interviewed by Vince McMahon. Jim says Bret is going to have a hell of a time and he's going to be running on fumes after Owen beats him at the WrestleMania. And Muta is just going to pick the bones of what's left. Bret comes down and tells Muta not to worry about his little brother Owen, because at WrestleMania, he will see why he is the best there is, the best there was, and the best that there ever will be, the excellence of execution. WrestleMania X 1994. Lex would cleanly beat Yokozuna and become the new #1 contender to the WWF Championship. Now, Owen still beats Bret on this night, solidifying Owen as a top heel within the WWF. The only difference we're going to have is Jim Cornette is ringside with Owen. And in the main event, the WWF champion, the Great Muta, the Pearl of the Orient, versus Bret the Hitman Hart. Now, this will be a 6-star Meltzer classic right here. Back and forth roller coaster. Both men shine. But as the match lingers on, Bret begins to wear down. Muta begins to toy with Bret, firmly in control at this point. Fuji distracts the ref as Jim Cornette holds Bret when Muta goes for the miss, but then Muta sprays Jim as Bret ducks and dodges the mist. At this point, Bret hits the side Russian leg sweep, the elbow drop off the middle turnbuckle, and then locks in the sharp shooter. Turns it over. Muta has nowhere to go, nothing to do but tap out to the sharpshooter so that we get a new WWF champion, Bret Hitman Hart. That's right, people. Bret just gave Muta his 3rd loss inside his first year in the WWF. Now, where will we go from here? You let me know. Drop some comments below, because let me say, we could really have some fun in 1994 with the Great Muta. He just come off a really solid year of 93 with wins over Hogan, Taker, Macho, Bret at times, Razor Ramon. I mean, this guy was on top like no other. So what, would he continue to stay on top? Would he regain the championship in 1994? Would Owen have won with the help of Muta in 1994? Drop a comment below and let me know. At what point does he go back to WCW? And since he was a WCW World Heavyweight Champion at one point in early 1993, would he regain an official WCW World Heavyweight Championship inside of the Nitro era? Drop a comment below, let me know, because at the end of the day, remember, the card is always subject to change.